In a quiet town on the edge of Mexico, far from the busy cities, there was a special place hidden from most people. It was not just any training center. It was a home for some of the smartest and bravest dogs ever trained. This place was run by Jake Holloway, a former Marine from the United States, and Sergio Velasquez, a respected officer in the Mexican police force. Both men had seen too much crime in their time, and they wanted to fight back in a way that no one expected. Together, they built a K-9 training facility, a safe place where dogs were trained to track down criminals, rescue innocent people, and protect those who could not protect themselves. These were not ordinary dogs. They were strong, disciplined, and loyal. Some were trained to find dangerous substances, others to detect weapons, and some were even prepared to help in life-or-death situations. Each dog had a special skill, and together, they'd made an unstoppable team. Jake and Sergio believed in their mission. They worked long hours with their trainers, forming unbreakable bonds with the dogs. Some of the best trained ones had names like Thor, a massive German shepherd with sharp instincts, Lobo, a Belgian Malinois known for his speed, and Xena, a fierce yet intelligent female who never backed down from a challenge. These dogs were more than just animals. They were warriors in their own way. The training facility was built in a quiet location, surrounded by trees and mountains. This kept it safe from unwanted visitors, but it also made it a target. The crime lords in the region knew about the place, and they did not like it. The Sombra Negra Cartel, one of the most feared groups in the area, saw the K-9 unit as a threat. These criminals had been running their illegal business without much trouble, but now they felt that the trained dogs and their handlers were getting in their way. One evening, a messenger arrived at the facility. He did not look like an ordinary visitor. He was nervous, sweating, and kept looking over his shoulder as if someone was watching him. He handed Sergio a small folded paper and whispered, "They say this is your only warning." Sergio unfolded the paper. It was a short but clear message. Shut it down, or face the consequences. There was no name, but they knew exactly who had sent it. Jake took the note, crumpled it in his fist, and looked at the training ground where the dogs were running drills with their handlers. He took a deep breath and said, "We're not going anywhere." Sergio nodded. He knew trouble was coming, but they had prepared for moments like this. What the cartel didn't know was that these dogs were more than just trained animals. They were ready for a fight. The days after the warning felt different. The air around the training facility was heavy with tension. The trainers continued their work, but they knew something was coming. Jake and Sergio had been in dangerous situations before, and they both understood that men like those in the Sombra Negra cartel did not make empty threats. Despite the danger, the training never stopped. Every morning, the handlers worked with the dogs, practicing commands, improving their speed, and sharpening their instincts. Thor, the strong German shepherd, was leading exercises in search and rescue, using his sharp nose to track hidden objects. Lobo, the fast Belgian Malinois, was mastering attack drills, responding to signals in a split second. Xena, the most intelligent of them all, was learning new maneuvers that made her almost impossible to stop. The bond between the trainers and the dogs was unbreakable. Each dog trusted their handler completely, and in return, the handlers treated them like family. The facility was not just a training center, it was a home, and no one was ready to give it up. One evening, just as the sun was setting, Sergio received a phone call from a trusted contact in law enforcement. The voice on the other end was urgent. "They're planning something. Be ready." Sergio's face hardened. He had been expecting this, but hearing it confirmed made his heart beat faster. He walked over to Jake, who was finishing up a training session with Thor. "It's happening sooner than we thought," Sergio said, his voice low. Jake wiped sweat from his forehead and gave a slow nod. "Then we prepare. We're not running." That night, Jake and Sergio gathered their team. They explained the situation clearly. The cartel wanted them gone, but they weren't going to back down. They had trained for this. The dogs weren't just skilled in exercises. They were trained for real-life situations. If the cartel thought they could simply walk in and take over, they were in for a surprise. The team set up defenses around the facility. They reinforced the gates, placed warning systems around the perimeter, and made sure every trainer knew their role. Most importantly, the dogs were ready. Their training had prepared them for situations where they had to track, defend, and act quickly under pressure. Despite the danger, there was no fear in their eyes. The trainers trusted their dogs, and the dogs trusted their handlers. They were not just fighting to save a building. They were protecting something much bigger. As the night grew darker, the facility remained quiet, but every person and every dog was alert. The shadows in the distance seemed to move, and a feeling of unease filled the air. Something was coming, and when it did, they would be ready. The night was silent, but the air felt heavy. Jake, Sergio, and their team stayed alert, watching the surroundings of the training facility. The dogs sensed something too. Thor stood near Jake, his ears pointed forward, listening. Lobo sniffed the air, pacing restlessly. Xena sat still, her sharp eyes locked on the shadows beyond the fence. The warning signs were there. The birds had stopped chirping. The wind carried an unfamiliar scent. It was only a matter of time. Then it happened. A loud explosion shattered the silence. Fire erupted from one of the storage sheds, sending flames high into the night sky. The force of the blast shook the ground, and for a second, everything seemed frozen. Then, gunshots rang out. The cartel had arrived. Sergio and Jake didn't panic. They had expected this. As smoke filled the air, they shouted orders. The handlers moved fast, releasing the dogs while taking defensive positions. The facility was under attack, but they weren't going to let it fall easily. Thor, Lobo, and Senna led the charge. Unlike the cartel, who relied on fear and force, these dogs fought with skill and intelligence. Thor dashed through the smoke, his powerful body knocking an attacker off balance. Lobo moved like lightning, slipping through gaps and catching another intruder by surprise. Xena, fast and precise, struck where the enemy least expected, forcing them to retreat. The cartel members weren't prepared for this. They thought they were attacking a simple training ground, but what they found was something far more dangerous. The dogs weren't just trained to obey commands. They were trained to outthink their enemies. Jake and Sergio worked alongside their team, guiding the dogs and defending their ground. Despite the fire spreading, the facility was still standing. The cartel had numbers, but the trainers had something stronger: loyalty, skill, and an unbreakable bond with their K9s. Minutes felt like hours as the battle continued. The attackers tried to push forward, but every step they took was met with resistance. The dogs moved with precision, cutting off their escape routes, creating chaos among their ranks. Then, as quickly as it had started, it was over. The cartel members who could still move ran into the darkness, leaving behind the wreckage they had caused. The fire crackled in the background, but the real danger had passed. Jake took a deep breath, looking around at the damage. The facility was hurt, but it was still standing. More importantly, his team and the dogs had fought back, and won. Sergio walked over, wiping dirt from his face. "They thought we'd be easy to take down," he said, looking toward the fleeing enemies. "They were wrong." Jake nodded. "And if they come back," he said, watching as Thor, Lobo, and Senna stood ready, their eyes still focused on the darkness ahead. "We'll be waiting." Smoke still filled the air as Jake, Sergio, and their team assessed the damage. The once quiet K9 training facility was now a battlefield. The fire had destroyed one of the storage sheds, and bullet holes scared the walls. But despite the attack, the place still stood. More importantly, the team and the dogs had survived. Thor, Lobo, and Senna moved through the debris, their sharp eyes scanning the area. The dogs were not just trained to fight. They were trained to protect. They sniffed out the trails left behind by the fleeing cartel members, their noses following scents that only they could detect. Their work wasn't over yet. Sergio crouched beside Cinna, running a hand over her head. "They didn't expect this," he said. "They thought they would scare us away." Jake nodded, his jaw tight. "Now they know we're not afraid." But both men knew that this was just the beginning. The cartel would not accept defeat so easily. They had attacked once, and they would try again. The real question was, when? The team got to work immediately. First, they secured what was left of the facility, making sure nothing was left unprotected. The remaining buildings were checked for damage, and supplies were gathered. Despite the destruction, the training had to continue. The dogs could sense the tension in the air, and they needed to stay sharp. As the sun rose, the team gathered for a meeting. Everyone was exhausted, but no one was ready to quit. "We need to strike first," Jake said. "We can't just sit here and wait for them to come back." Sergio agreed. "The cartel thinks they can walk all over us. We need to show them they're wrong." The plan was simple: use the K9s to track the cartel's movements and disrupt their operations. The cartel had power, weapons, and numbers, but what they didn't have was the skill of these highly trained dogs. Lobo had already picked up a scent. The fast Belgian Malinois sniffed the ground and let out a low growl. He had found something. The team followed him to the edge of the facility, where fresh tire tracks cut through the dirt. The attackers had left in a hurry, but they had left behind a trail that the dogs could follow. "This is our chance," Jake said, looking at the tracks. "They think they escaped, but we're not letting them go that easy." The team prepared to move. With the dogs leading the way, they would track down the cartel's hideout and make sure they knew that the K9 unit was not to be underestimated. Thor, Lobo, and Senna stood at the front, ready for the hunt. Their ears were alert, their noses sharp, and their eyes filled with determination. This fight wasn't over. It was just getting started. The sun was just beginning to rise when Jake, Sergio, and their team set out. The air was cool, but there was tension in every step they took. The K9s moved ahead, their noses close to the ground, following the scent left behind by the fleeing cartel members. Thor, the strong German shepherd, led the way, his sharp instincts guiding the team. Lobo and Senna followed closely, their senses alert for any sign of danger. The tire tracks in the dirt told a clear story. The attackers had left in a hurry. Some had run on foot, while others had escaped in vehicles. But no matter how far they had gone, they couldn't hide from the dogs. As they moved through the thick forest surrounding the facility, the dogs stopped suddenly. Lobo let out a low growl, his body tense. Xena's ears perked up, her sharp eyes focused on something in the distance. The team immediately crouched down, staying silent. Sergio pulled out his binoculars and scanned the area ahead. His heart pounded as he spotted movement. A cartel lookout. The man stood near a small wooden hut, his eyes scanning the area as if he expected trouble. He was guarding something. But what? Jake whispered, "They're close." The dogs led us straight to them. The team moved carefully, staying hidden among the trees. They had trained for moments like this: stealth, patience, and teamwork. The dogs knew what to do without being told. Xena was the first to move. She crept forward silently, using the shadows to hide. The lookout had no idea she was there. Within seconds, she was close enough to strike. With a sudden burst of speed, she lunged, knocking the man off balance. The team rushed in before he could react, securing him quickly and quietly. Sergio knelt beside the captured man. "Where is your base?" he asked. The man shook his head, refusing to speak, but he didn't realize that the K9s were already answering the question for him. Thor and Lobo sniffed the air, their noses catching the scent of more people nearby. The dogs pulled forward, eager to continue tracking. Jake nodded. "We don't need him to talk. The dogs will lead us straight to them." Moving carefully, the team followed Thor, Lobo, and Senna deeper into the forest. Every step brought them closer to the cartel's hideout. Soon, they reached a clearing. Hidden between the trees was a small compound, several buildings, armed guards, and parked vehicles. This was it, the cartel's base. Jake took a deep breath. Now they're going to see what our dogs can really do. The canines stood at the front, ready for the next move. The fight wasn't over yet. In fact, it was just beginning. The team crouched low, hidden behind the thick trees, their eyes locked on the cartel's hideout. The compound wasn't large, but it was heavily guarded. Armed men walked around the area, keeping watch. The sound of distant laughter and voices filled the air. They weren't expecting trouble, but trouble was already here. Thor, Lobo, and Senna stood silently at the front, their eyes sharp, their ears twitching as they listened to every movement. The dogs sensed something the humans couldn't. Their instincts told them the perfect moment to strike. Sergio turned to Jake and whispered, "We have the advantage of surprise. If we move fast, they won't know what hit them." Jake nodded. "Let's make this count." The team split into small groups. They moved carefully through the trees, getting closer to the compound. The dogs stayed focused, waiting for the signal. Every second felt longer than the last, but they had to be patient. One wrong move, and the cartel would turn the entire area into chaos. Then it was time. Sergio gave a short whistle, a signal only the canines understood. In an instant, the dogs launched into action. Thor was the first to move. His strong legs carried him forward with incredible speed. Before the first guard even realized what was happening, Thor had tackled him to the ground, his powerful grip preventing him from calling for help. Lobo was next. The fast Belgian Malinois sprinted toward another guard, dodging obstacles with ease. Within seconds, the guard was disarmed, unable to react before Lobo took him down. Xena, smaller but just as skilled, moved with precision. She slipped through the shadows, circling around to block the enemies from escaping. She growled low, warning them. There was no way out. The cartel guards panicked. Some tried to grab their weapons, but the dogs were too quick. By the time they aimed, the team had already moved in. Jake and Sergio's men secured the area, working in perfect sync with the K9s. Every move had been planned, every step executed with precision. The cartel had expected an ordinary fight. Instead, they were overwhelmed by speed, skill, and strategy. Within minutes, the compound was under control. The remaining cartel members surrendered, their faces filled with shock. They had never seen anything like this before. Sergio stepped forward, looking around at the captured men. "This is what happens when you underestimate us." Jake patted Thor on the head, his heart still racing from the action. "And this is only the beginning." The team searched the compound, gathering important information. The cartel's plans, their hideouts, their next moves. It was all there. This wasn't just a small victory. It was the turning point. As the team prepared to leave, the K9s stood proudly, their heads held high. They had fought, they had won, and they had proven something important. This battle wasn't just for humans. The dogs were warriors too. The compound was silent now. The once powerful cartel members sat on the ground, their hands tied, their faces filled with shock. They had expected an easy fight. Instead, they had been outmatched by a team of skilled trainers and their highly trained K9s. Jake, Sergio, and the rest of the team moved quickly, searching the area. The cartel's base was small, but it held valuable information. Stacks of papers, maps, and marked locations covered a table inside one of the buildings. A laptop sat open, its screen showing messages about shipments and meetings. Sergio picked up one of the maps and studied it. "They have more hideouts," he said, pointing at several marked locations, "and they're planning something big." Jake clenched his fists. "We can't let them regroup. We need to hit them before they have a chance." But before they could decide their next move, Lobo let out a sharp bark. His ears were up, his nose twitching. He had sensed something. Thor and Xena reacted, their bodies tense, their eyes fixed on the trees beyond the compound. Something, or someone, was coming. The team quickly took their positions, ready for anything. The cartel's main force had been caught off guard, but what if reinforcements were on the way? The rustling in the trees grew louder. The tension in the air was thick. The team held their breath. Then, a man stumbled out of the forest, his hands raised in surrender. His clothes were dirty, his face covered in sweat. He wasn't here to fight. He was running. Sergio stepped forward, his eyes narrowing. "Who are you?" The man gasped for breath before speaking. "I was forced to work for them," he said, his voice shaking. "They have more men, a bigger base, and they're planning to burn down more places. You're not safe." Jake and Sergio exchanged a look. This wasn't over. The cartel wasn't just a small group. They were larger, more dangerous, and still very much active. Sergio looked down at the dogs. "They fought hard tonight," he said, "but the real battle is just beginning." Jake took a deep breath, nodding. "Then we make the first move." The team had taken down one base, but there were more. The fight wasn't over yet, but now they had something the cartel didn't expect. An army of trained K9s, fearless, intelligent, and ready for whatever came next. As the first light of dawn broke through the trees, Thor, Lobo, and Xena stood at the front of the team, their eyes locked on the horizon. They weren't just following orders. They were leading the way. The sun had fully risen, casting golden light over the wrecked compound. The air was still heavy with the scent of smoke and sweat, but the battle was over for now. Jake, Sergio, and their team stood together, taking in everything that had happened. Thor, Lobo, and Xena sat beside them, their tongues hanging out as they caught their breath. The dogs had worked hard, proving once again that they were more than just animals. They were warriors, partners, and protectors. Jake looked at the captured cartel members, then turned to Sergio. "We have to move fast," he said. "If they have more hideouts, they'll be coming for us." Sergio nodded, glancing at the map they had found inside the compound. "This is just one piece of a much bigger network." He traced his finger over a marked location. "If we hit their main base, we can take them down for good." But before they could make a plan, the man who had surrendered earlier stepped forward. His face was filled with fear, but his voice was steady. "They won't stop," he warned. "They'll send more men, more weapons. You need to be ready." Jake smiled slightly. "We are ready." The team gathered their supplies, making sure they had everything they needed. They called for backup to take the captured cartel members into custody, but they weren't waiting for help to continue the fight. They were taking action. Lobo let out a sharp bark, his ears twitching. He had picked up a scent again. Thor and Xena followed, their bodies tense, their noses sniffing the air. They were tracking something, or someone. Jake tightened his grip on his gear. "Let's go." The team moved quickly, following the dogs into the trees. The cartel thought they could run, that they could hide, but they had never faced enemies like these before. With every step, the K9s led the way, their instincts guiding them toward the next battle. And this time, they weren't just defending themselves. They were hunting the hunters. The fight wasn't over. It was just beginning.